Once upon a time, not in a magical kingdom, but in a stinking, rat-infested medieval town, people were dying. A lot. Enter the plague doctor. If you're imagining a wise old man with a flowing robe and gentle bedside manner, stop. Replace him with a guy in a bird mask who smells like a spice rack and has the bedside charm of a tax collector. Plague doctors weren't heroes. Most were broke, desperate, or bored. Many weren't even real doctors. They were surgeons, barbers, or people who once dissected a frog and felt qualified. Towns hired them out of sheer panic. No one else wanted the job. So if you had a heartbeat and no fear of death, congratulations, you were hired. Their uniform? An early version of a hazmat suit, if hazmat suits were designed by a theater kid during Halloween. Thick leather robe, gloves, boots, wide-brimmed hat, and the iconic beaked mask. The beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, and anything that smelled better than death. Cinnamon, roses, mint, cloves, like a charcuterie board in your face. People believed in miasma, or bad air causing illness. So stuffing your face with herbs made sense, if you didn't know about germs. The leather was meant to keep the disease out. Unfortunately, it also kept the sweat, stink, and despair in. The suit was hot, heavy, and smelled like an armpit wrapped in stew meat. Imagine seeing one of these bird-masked figures walking toward your house. You didn't feel hopeful, you felt doomed. To many people, the plague doctor was like the medieval version of the Grim Reaper. If you saw one, someone was going to die, possibly you. Their medical kit included a stick to poke patients without touching them, a jar of leeches, scissors, and occasionally a Bible. If it sounds like the setup to a horror movie, that's because it basically was. The stick was also used to push back angry villagers, dual purpose. Doctors at the time believed that illness came from imbalanced humors. So they bled people, a lot. Got a headache? Let's remove some blood. Buboes the size of apples? More blood. If the patient died, at least their fluids were balanced on the way out. The plague had a smell, rotting bodies, pus-filled wounds, feces, burning herbs, and sweaty men in leather. It was like someone lit a compost bin on fire and then cooked onions on top of it. Plague doctors got used to it, or they passed out. Either way, it lingered. Plague doctors rarely slept well. They stayed in quarantine zones, often inside or near plague hospitals. That meant endless groaning, coughing, dying, and screaming. Their beds were often hay stuffed with straw, or nothing. Lice were constant, so was fear. What did they eat? Whatever they could. Usually stale bread, hard cheese, and salted meat. Nothing fresh, no fruits or veggies. Water was risky, wine, if they were lucky. Many kept cloves in their mouths not for flavor, but to hide the taste of rot in the air. Plague doctors were pariahs. They couldn't mingle. They couldn't go to church. Plague doctors weren't immune. Their gear was a joke by modern standards. Many caught the very plague they were hired to fight. If they got sick, no one would treat them. Irony at its cruelest. The only retirement plan? A grave. Thinking about dating? Too bad. Most plague doctors were either too sick, too scary, or too covered in pus to be considered crush-worthy. Plus, it's hard to flirt when your breath smells like clove-soaked despair and you wear leather training. There was barely any. Maybe a quick lecture about leeches and prayers, and off you went. Some towns even hired teenagers if they looked mature enough. All you needed was a strong stomach and very little self-preservation instinct. Training? There was barely any. Maybe a quick lecture about leeches and prayers, and off you went. Some towns even hired teenagers if they looked mature enough. All you needed was a strong stomach and very little self-preservation instinct. Doctors who tried to quit mid-outbreak? Big no-no. Some were legally forbidden from leaving. Others were guilt-tripped by the church. One even got locked in a room by the mayor so he couldn't escape. Imagine being grounded by a town. Mailer call and the loneliness parade. Letters from home were rare. Mail carriers avoided plague zones. Even if you got a letter, it was often singed or soaked in vinegar to clean it. Messages were vague, like, "Hope you're not dead. Love, Mom." Plague doctors often worked with apothecaries. That sounds helpful until you realize most of them were mixing herbs based on superstition. One remedy involved onions in your armpits. Another said to rub crushed emeralds on your tongue. Science. The beak wasn't just ridiculous, it was a hazard. If it was too long, you couldn't see. Too short and it didn't filter anything. Some doctors trimmed them down, which made them look less scary but also less protected. Fashion versus function, medieval edition. Some plague doctors kept journals. What started as medical logs quickly turned into existential ramblings. Patient number 37, dead. Patient number 38, dead. Me, tired, itchy, slightly cursed. You know what spread the plague? Rats and fleas. You know who was constantly surrounded by both? Yep, doctors. They shared beds with fleas and walked streets crawling with rats. Occasionally, rats nibbled on corpses or boots. When in doubt, medieval people just burned stuff. Clothes, burn them. Furniture, burn it. Bodies? Yep. Sometimes entire houses. Plague doctors had to supervise these bonfires, which smelled like regret and pork gone wrong. Doctors often had to coordinate burials, which meant directing carts full of corpses, arguing with gravediggers, and occasionally helping dig. There weren't enough graves. Sometimes they stacked bodies like cordwood. Dignity was optional. City officials rarely helped. They gave orders, demanded reports, then hid in their mansions. Some blamed plague doctors for being ineffective, despite giving them zero resources. It's like yelling at your shovel for not growing crops. Some plague doctors had animal companions, cats to eat rats, dogs to bark at everything. One famous doctor had a raven named Bartholomew. The raven outlived him. That bird probably judged every decision he made. Doctation was weird. Plague doctors had to record deaths, symptoms, last words, and sometimes the weather. No one knew what data mattered. One guy wrote, cloudy, pus still yellow. Wake up, smell death, poke a few bodies, bleed a screaming patient, shout at a rat, write a sad journal entry, eat old bread, cry, sleep on straw, repeat. The job was thankless, horrifying, and exhausting, but someone had to do it. Some towns created full-on quarantine zones. Doctors had to enter through guarded gates and often couldn't leave for weeks. They were stuck inside with the dying, the already dead, and the soon-to-be-dead. The guards didn't even say goodbye, just slammed the gates shut like sealing a tomb. In many towns, plague doctors were expected to record deaths for tax purposes. That's right. Sorry your whole family is dead, but did they pay their bread levy last month? It turned healing into accounting. Miserable and morbid. Many plague doctors were forced to live in plague hospitals or designated homes, usually the most haunted, creaky, collapsing buildings in town. They shared space with patients, rats, fleas, and possibly ghosts. Privacy? Non-existent. Sanity? Optional. People tried all kinds of folk remedies, and doctors had to pretend to entertain them. Sure, madam, boil that toad in wine and apply it to your chest. Why not? If the doctor refused, people blamed him for the death. If he agreed and the patient died, it was still his fault. A common treatment? Cupping, which involved placing hot glass or metal cups on the skin to draw out evil vapors. The result? Blisters, burns, and screams. Doctors were basically medieval baristas, except the espresso was your skin. Some plague sufferers hallucinated or went delirious. Doctors got punched, kicked, bitten, or worse. One poor soul had a patient sneeze a tooth into his mouth. He never recovered emotionally. Imagine a city where all you hear is coughing, wailing, funeral bells, shouting clergy, creaking carts, and the endless scratching of rats. Plague doctors learned to tune it out until it haunted their dreams. That's when the clove chewing intensified. To survive, some doctors fake symptoms just to get out. Oh no, I think I've caught the plague. They dramatically faint, disappear for 2 weeks, then show up claiming a miraculous recovery. Bold strategy. Sometimes it worked. Doctors had families too, often far away. Letters were slow. Visits were forbidden. Many plague doctors never saw their loved ones again. Others got home only to find they weren't welcome. Too risky. Thanks for your service. Please sleep in the barn. Many plague doctors didn't get proper burials. If they died, their bodies were burned, dumped, or buried in mass graves. No funerals, no names. Just another number in the endless tally of the dead. The outfit might have looked iconic, but it was a medieval oven. Underneath the leather were layers of cloth, stuffing, and wool. In the summer, doctors basically slow cooked inside their own clothes. The only breeze they felt was from people running away. Running was sometimes part of the job. Angry families, panicked mobs, and the occasional bear, don't ask, made plague doctors unexpectedly athletic. The mask didn't help visibility, and the robe wasn't built for sprinting. Trip and fall, you're a corpse buffet. Doctors often burned aromatic herbs in their beaks or carried pomanders, scented balls on sticks, to ward off disease. Some even smoked tobacco constantly. Did it work? No. Did it make them smell like a barbecue? Absolutely. Plague doctors sometimes clashed with religious leaders. The clergy wanted prayer. The doctors wanted leeches. Townspeople were caught between holy water and vinegar baths. One doctor wrote, "I was accused of heresy for applying mustard to a man's foot." No one reminded society of death quite like plague doctors. Their mere presence triggered existential dread. Some towns banned them from public spaces just to keep morale up. Sure, people are dying, but let's not kill the vibe. If the plague wasn't blamed on the doctor, it was blamed on witches, foreigners, or celestial bodies. Still, the doctor was often in the top 5 suspects. Being helpful didn't make him popular, it just made him a more visible target. Some cities made doctors inventory the possessions of the dead. Imagine going through someone's crusty socks and broken spoons while your own boots squelch in muck. Bonus: anything valuable might be claimed by the state. Hope you like awkward conversations. Plague doctors occasionally cut open bodies to learn, but tools were crude, ventilation was non-existent, and you risked being mistaken for a necromancer. Plus, dissecting something that's already half melted? Not ideal. Even after outbreaks, doctors were marked. No one forgot their face or mask. People whispered in taverns. Children hid. Some moved to other towns to escape their reputation. Others embraced it and started charging for ghost stories. So why take the job? Desperation, a sense of duty, ego, or because they thought they could help. Plague doctors weren't saints, but many were the only ones willing to walk into hell with a stick, a mask, and a pouch of clothes. Sometimes towns tried to rate plague doctors. Unofficially, of course, gossip, angry notes nailed to doors, or even crude drawings on outhouse walls let people know who sucked. Imagine treating 300 people in a week and still getting a 1-star rating because someone's cousin died. Doctors didn't sleep well. Their dreams were full of death, screaming, and more bird masks. Some wrote that they would wake in cold sweats, convinced they had the plague. One poor soul wrote in his journal, "I coughed twice and made peace with God." Payment was tricky. Some towns agreed to pay doctors at the end of the outbreak. Spoiler, many towns never paid. They'd say, "Well, since people are still dying, clearly you didn't do your job." It was the medieval version of exposure as compensation. Becoming a plague doctor wasn't like applying to Harvard. Some were volunteers. Others were dragged in from medical school mid-lecture. One town reportedly hired a guy just because he owned a mask. That's it. No degree, just vibes. Plague doctors had to record who was sick, who died, how long they suffered, and what treatments were tried. No assistants, no quills that worked, just blood-stained scrolls and the creeping realization that it was all pretty useless. Each day was marked by the constant ringing of funeral bells. The soundtrack of their job was a mix of sobbing, coughing, and bells. One doctor wrote that the sound haunted him more than the smell, and that's saying something. Believe it or not, maggots were sometimes used to clean wounds. Did it work? Technically, yes. Did plague doctors like it? Not at all. Watching your patient squirm while bugs did your job was both fascinating and horrifying. Like an episode of medieval Fear Factor. Sometimes doctors had to calm riots when people accused plague victims of witchcraft or poisoning wells. Imagine trying to stop an angry mob with nothing but a stick and a bird mask. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Doesn't work when they think you're Satan's intern. Doctors had to visit homes, towns, and quarantine ships. They trudged through swamps, snow, and sewage-filled streets. Their boots were often thin leather and their feet constantly wet. That smell, that was trench foot marinated in rose water. Even off-duty, doctors were encouraged to keep their masks on in public. Not for health reasons, but so people would recognize and avoid them. Some wore it so long it left scars on their faces. Others said they forgot what their own face looked like. People were paranoid. If a doctor didn't inspect a house thoroughly enough, families freaked out. You didn't touch Uncle's feet. Maybe he's just napping. Meanwhile, Uncle was 3 shades of purple and missing a toe. Weirdly, some nobles visited plague areas just to see it. Guess who had to guide them around like it was a medieval safari? Yup, the doctor. Over here, we have a bubonic beauty. And to the left, ah yes, that man's arm just fell off. Doctors were told to avoid getting too close to patients, but also expected to examine sores, drain buboes, and comfort the dying. You couldn't win. Stay back? Heartless. Get close? Contagious. Either way, you'd catch something. Probably scurvy at the very least. Meal breaks weren't relaxing. You'd unwrap some hard bread and cheese next to a moaning patient, or while stepping over bodies. Some doctors refused to eat during work hours altogether, which just made them dizzy and hangry. Medieval Uber Eats was not a thing. Doctors often made their own instruments, scalpels from old knives, tweezers from fireplace tongs, syringes from goose quills. Sanitation? Optional. Rust? Guaranteed. You went in for a lanced boil and came out with tetanus. No clocks, no schedules. Time was tracked by how many people had died or how many streets you'd walked. It must be noon. I've seen 6 corpses, 1 exorcism, and 3 fainting goats. The beak mask looked cool in paintings, but in reality it blocked your view, muffled your voice, and hit people in the face when you leaned over. Intimate care became awkward jousting matches between bird snouts and festering wounds. If the plague lingered too long, townspeople got angry. And the doctor was the nearest blame dump. Some were pelted with rotten vegetables. One had his house burned down. Another was locked in a cellar for morale reasons. Even other physicians looked down on plague doctors, calling them pest pokers or corpse babysitters. It was like being the substitute teacher of medicine, underpaid, overworked, and constantly questioned. Many doctors wrote grim journals near the end of their lives. "I no longer know joy," one scribbled. "The rats sleep better than I do," wrote another. And a favorite, "If I hear one more bell, I'm walking into the river." People gave doctors weird things as thanks. Dead chickens, bones shaped like saints, jars of goose fat. One doctor got a cursed ring. Another was gifted a sheep that followed him everywhere and bleated during exams. Medieval gratitude was chaotic. People gave doctors weird things as thanks. Dead chickens, bones shaped like saints, jars of goose fat. One doctor got a cursed ring. Another was gifted a sheep that followed him everywhere and bleated during exams. Medieval gratitude was chaotic. People gave doctors weird things as thanks. Dead chickens, bones shaped like saints, jars of goose fat. One doctor got a cursed ring. Another was gifted a sheep that followed him everywhere and bleated during exams. Medieval gratitude was chaotic. Doctors measured how bad a day was by how many times someone screamed at them. Only 4 screamers today? Must be Tuesday. If someone didn't scream when touched, they were probably already dead or in denial. Plague doctors often walked through open gutters where waste from entire neighborhoods flowed. They couldn't hold their robes up. Their hands were full of gear. So their hems just dragged, and then dragged that into someone's home. Sanitation? Never heard of her. Some beak masks fell apart mid-treatment. One doctor sneezed, the beak flew off, and he inhaled straight plague. Another had his break in a fistfight with a patient's uncle. Duct tape hadn't been invented, so repairs were done with twine and hope. Rats weren't just annoying, they were everywhere. One account tells of a doctor who entered a cellar and met a rat king. A nest of rats knotted by their tails. He left, burned his robe, and refused to ever treat basements again. Some plague zones were in marshes where everything was wet, moldy, and full of leeches. Doctors had to tie their masks tighter so mosquitoes didn't fly in. One said he'd rather be haunted by ghosts than bitten by sky lice. Sometimes a doctor was sent to treat his own village, or worse, his own relatives. Imagine knocking and your aunt says, "Oh good, you're here. I'm oozing again." One poor guy had to diagnose his ex. She faked symptoms to get his attention. By the late stages of an outbreak, most doctors stopped pretending. They gave out holy water that was just rainwater, nodded during nonsense remedies, and wrote "Beyond Hope" in Latin on half the doors. Sometimes, all you could do was watch and endure. Some plague doctors were sent to isolated villages, and then forgotten. One guy was locked in a quarantine zone and the gatekeeper died. He lived off bread mold and rainwater until someone finally remembered him. It took 3 weeks. One doctor was forced to officiate a wedding between 2 infected lovers. Everyone wore masks, no one touched, and the couple kissed through a wax cloth. He later said, "It was the most romantic and horrifying thing I've ever seen." Doctors still use bloodletting, even for plague. Sometimes it worked, sometimes the patient passed out, sometimes they just bled more and died. It was basically medieval roulette, but with fewer rules and more leeches. Doctors were expected to look sad and serious at all times. Smile, and people thought you were possessed. One cheerful doctor was accused of sorcery because he laughed too often. Turns out he just had a nervous giggle. Towns worried about plague victims rising from the dead, yes, really. So doctors sometimes had to watch graveyards overnight. Imagine being paid in stale bread to sit alone with a shovel and torch while wolves howled. Some doctors drank wine during house calls, to kill germs, of course. One was so drunk he tried to diagnose a statue. Another passed out in a barn and woke up with goats nibbling his mask. Children ran from doctors shouting, "The crow comes." One artist even drew plague doctors with wings. Over time, the bird mask became a symbol of death, not healing. You showed up, people cried. Fun times. The herbs in the mask were supposed to protect the doctor from miasma, but often the smell was worse than the plague. A bad mix, like garlic and dried eel, could cause fainting. One guy sneezed so hard he fell downstairs. When in doubt, plague doctors advised burning clothes, beds, houses, sometimes entire streets. One letter simply read, "Your village is past saving, torch it. Sorry." It wasn't cold, it was realistic. There was no retirement plan. Most doctors either died from plague, disappeared, or moved far away under a new name. A few became tavern storytellers. One wrote, "I traded my mask for mead, and I've never been happier." Once the plague, quote, ended, doctors were often left with a surplus of odd remedies. Jars of toad ash, snake oil, dried beetles, and mystery potions. Some tried to sell them to apothecaries. Others buried them in their backyards like cursed loot. When the worst was over, no one thanked the doctors. In fact, many towns kicked them out, worried they still carried plague. One guy returned to his home city only to be denied entry by his own brother. Gratitude was not a medieval strong suit. After seeing how much attention plague doctors got, or maybe the outfits, con men began dressing up as them for money, scams, or laughs. One, quote, doctor turned out to be a pickpocket who stored stolen goods in his beak. Despite all their work, plague doctors got a reputation as omens of death. Their masks were burned in effigy. Their names were forgotten. People remembered the plague, not the ones who tried to fight it. Harsh, but very medieval. Some surviving masks and robes were said to be cursed. Museums refused to take them. A few were buried like corpses. One was rumored to whisper at night, "Smells like vinegar," it would say. Or maybe that was just lingering herbs. Doctors who lived often vanished from records. Maybe they moved. Maybe they changed names. Maybe they just didn't want to be known as that guy from the bird mask thing. Honestly, who could blame them? A record from the 17th century tells of one final plague doctor who outlived his colleagues, pets, and even the disease. He kept the mask on for years, just in case. He died peacefully at 82, surrounded by dried flowers and stories no one believed. Centuries later, plague doctors made a comeback as costumes, memes, Halloween decor. Ironically, the same beak that terrified dying peasants now sits next to rubber chickens at party stores. History is weird like that. Being a plague doctor wasn't about heroism or reward. It was pain, fear, discomfort, and guessing in the dark. But they showed up. In a world falling apart, that counted for something, even if they smelled like pickled regret. So next time you see a plague doctor in a game or show, don't just laugh. Remember the real ones. They didn't have science, support, or soap. Just courage, a creepy mask, and a weirdly optimistic job title. Let's review the essentials. A bird mask stuffed with herbs, a waxed robe, a wooden cane and shoes, 2 sizes too small. Throw in questionable medical knowledge, sleep deprivation, and the smell of despair, and you're ready to hit the streets. Medieval internship, here you come. Believe it or not, some plague doctors fell in love during outbreaks. One married a midwife he met while treating a quarantine house. Their first date involved disinfecting each other with vinegar. Romantic, right? To pass time or soothe patients, some doctors played instruments, lutes, fiddles, even bagpipes. One wrote songs about different types of buboes. Another accidentally started a plague-themed tavern sing-along. Pop Goes the Pustule never made it to the charts. A few brave souls actually admired plague doctors. Kids drew pictures, townsfolk wrote poems. One woman sent a pie with, "To the brave birdman," carved in crust. He wept, then got food poisoning. Still, sweet gesture. Even after death, some believe plague doctors wandered as spirits, seeking patients they couldn't save. Stories tell of silent, masked figures roaming alleys, still carrying their canes. Or maybe it's just someone in a really committed cosplay. Wearing that leather mask all day left marks, literally. Some doctors developed permanent beak-shaped tan lines. Others got rashes where the mask rubbed. One wrote, "My nose itches like the devil, but I daren't scratch lest I die sniffing." Doctors carried canes to poke patients from a distance, but some collected them like fashion accessories, engraved tips, snake carvings, silver caps. One guy had a cane with a wine flask inside, functional and festive. Other medical professionals formed guilds with benefits and support. Plague doctors? Not invited. They were considered too lowly or too doomed. "Don't want your cursed energy in our banquet," they said. Real supportive. In one bizarre case, a plague doctor used live pigeons in a folk remedy, pressing them against infected armpits. The pigeons understandably protested. One flew up his sleeve, another bit his lip. He declared pigeons the angriest medicine. One plague doctor wrote a farewell note before disappearing. "To the next poor soul wearing this mask, God help you. Take vinegar baths. Trust no one. Burn your boots. And never, ever look a rat in the eye." No one warned the doctors about the endless fluids. Pus, blood, bile, drool, goo of unknown origin. Some patients exploded like overripe fruit. "Bring towels," said one doctor, "and never trust a quiet boil." Boots wore out fast, especially when you walk 20 miles a day. Many plague doctors wore mismatched shoes, stolen shoes, or no shoes. One guy made boots out of old curtain leather. He called them disease slippers. Doctors developed a sort of shorthand to communicate quickly. BL meant black lumps. GNR meant get new robe. SOS wasn't save our souls. It meant smells of something. Efficiency, but make it cryptic. Some doctors had pets, usually cats, to keep rats away. One doctor had a one-eyed raven that mimicked coughs. Another had a ferret that stole bandages. Patients either found them comforting or cursed, no in between. One small town couldn't afford gold, so they paid their plague doctor in smoked sausages. At first it was cute. By week 5, his house smelled like a meat cellar, and stray dogs followed him everywhere. Some towns tried to stay in contact with their plague doctors via messenger pigeons, but pigeons don't like flying into disease zones. One bird dropped dead mid-flight. Another flew in, saw the chaos, and immediately turned around. The only message that arrived intact read, "Please don't die." Doctors worked by candlelight. During shortages, they used lard lamps, glowing fungus, or just hoped the moon was bright. One doctor used a skull as a candle holder. It was metal, but also deeply concerning to everyone else in the room. If too many people died under a doctor's care, whispers started. Is he healing or hexing? One doctor was accused of witchcraft after treating someone who then coughed up frogs. It was really a hallucination. Trial by superstition was a real job hazard. That long beak, not door-friendly. One doctor leaned down to examine a patient and got stuck between two beams. He had to wiggle free while the patient screamed, "Bird demon! Bird demon!" Graceful exits were rare. Some plague doctors trained their whole lives for a medical exam they never got to take, because, well, everyone died. One guy carried study notes in his pocket during his rounds. "In case I survive long enough to graduate," he said. He didn't. Doctors were often called in to guess whether a lump was just a swollen gland or a plague bubo. There was no testing, just squinting, poking, and hoping it didn't burst. One doctor poked a suspicious boil and got squirted in the eye. He quit that day. Desperate to cure the plague, some doctors dabbled in alchemy. They boiled mercury, sniffed arsenic fumes, and even made tonics with ground-up emeralds. One proudly declared, "I have invented plague-proof wine." He immediately passed out from lead poisoning. Crows, rooks, and ravens didn't take kindly to men in bird masks. Some doctors were dive-bombed. One poor fellow got pecked on the head during a funeral and fell into the grave. Feathers flew, someone fainted, and the priest just kept reading the psalm. Hydration was rare. People offered plague doctors wine, ale, and more wine. Clean water? Never. One doctor was permanently tipsy by week 2 and forgot which town he was working in. His medical notes just said, "Looks plaguey." A doctor who survived 4 plagues started collecting the masks of colleagues who didn't make it. His home became a wall of beaks. He said it was for remembrance. Others said it was deeply haunted. By the end, even he was afraid to sleep near them. With no pharmacy nearby, plague doctors got creative. Dung mixed with rose oil? Check. Moldy bread poultices? Absolutely. One poor soul tried blessed vinegar smoked over unicorn bone. It was a goat femur. The patient died, but smelled amazing. Doctors had to send plague reports to officials. These letters were often burned before being read. One mayor said, "If it's sealed with wax and smells like thyme, I'm not touching it." The messenger agreed and tossed it into a moat. To calm dying patients, some doctors told comforting tales. Others, exhausted and unhinged, made up wild stories. If you hear the rats whisper, it means you'll get better. No one believed them. But the whispering, that happened. Thanks, fever dreams. With masks on and vision limited, some doctors treated the wrong person entirely. One guy accidentally lanced a healthy baker who was napping. Another tried to diagnose a statue. To be fair, it did look pale and motionless. Believe it or not, some townsfolk sang plague-specific songs outside the doctor's door. Not for comfort, for complaints. The Birdman brings doom, you missed my aunt, and the classic, fix my boobos or get out, medieval yelp, basically. Doctors wore robes coated in wax to block bad air. Great idea until summer. One guy passed out when his wax robe softened, stuck to a bench and wouldn't let go. They had to chisel him free like a sad, sweaty candle. Some townsfolk pretended to be infected just to get food, rest, or avoid chores. A doctor once diagnosed 7 patients in one home, only to realize they were faking and holding a poker game under the blankets. He still billed them. In one particularly cursed village, the townspeople blamed the plague doctor for the plague. They chased him out with pitchforks, torches, and a cabbage catapult. He escaped, but his beak was never the same. Doctors got summoned at ungodly hours. "Doctor, my cousin is leaking again." One doctor was woken up 12 times in one night. The 12th call? "My neighbor's pig won't stop coughing." He treated the pig. It lived. The neighbor did not. Where do you hang your mask after a long day of plague? Turns out, nowhere. They didn't fit in bags, drawers, or on pegs. One doctor kept his in a chicken coop. It absorbed the smell. Forever. He renamed it Cluckface. 2 doctors accidentally swapped masks during a chaotic morning. One realized only after noticing the herbs smelled weirdly optimistic. The other panicked, thinking he'd been cursed. They never spoke again, but both claimed to feel slightly more competent afterward. Some masks were packed with very strong herbs, like belladonna or opium poppy. One doctor admitted he spent an entire day diagnosing a tree stump. "It had buboes, I swear," he wrote in his journal. Spoiler, it was a barrel. In an effort to educate townsfolk, one plague doctor created hand puppets. One was named Dr. Beacums, and the other was Lil Bubo. The show lasted 2 days before a monk accused them of heresy. The puppets were burned, the children wept. Some plague doctors wrote dramatic wills just in case. One letter read, "To my dog I leave my walking stick. To my town I leave my regrets. To my enemies, may you all get footboils." Medieval closure was spicy. Keeping the beak clean was tricky. Some boiled it, some smoked it over sage. One scrubbed his with sand and vinegar, and accidentally erased half his nosepiece? Minimalist now, he shrugged. It was not a compliment. One doctor's robe was stolen while he bathed in a creek, a rare event. He had to walk back to town in nothing but his mask, boots, and attitude. The town crier announced it before he arrived. Feathered man streaks through plague district. Some plague doctors wore bells to warn people they were coming. One had a bell that refused to stop ringing. He buried it in the woods, but it still chimed faintly in his dreams. Either it was cursed, or he was too tired to care. To avoid infection, some doctors added armor, wooden chest plates, iron gloves, even a colander tied to their backs. One was so clunky he couldn't bend over. His solution? Treat only tall patients. The rest? Try not to die so low, he'd say. A few towns tried to turn their plague doctor into a morale booster. One mayor gave his doctor a cape and declared him Sir Purger of Pestilence. Kids threw flowers at him. He tripped. The cape caught fire. Morale plummeted. Doctors didn't always die with dignity. One's final words were, "Don't let the goat near my herbs." Another said, "Tell them the rats were smarter than we thought." Historians still debate if that was metaphor or actual paranoia. When a mask cracked, doctors patched it with anything: scrap leather, parchment, or even wax paper. One guy used an old love letter. The patient he treated that day cried, not because of the illness, but the emotional damage from reading it mid-fever. Every town had different rules. In one, you had to enter homes backward. In another, you had to bow before touching a corpse. One doctor got arrested for violating plague hat protocol. He wasn't even wearing a hat, it was a boiled cabbage. Everyone became an expert. Blacksmiths recommended soot. Barbers said, just drain more blood. Priests offered prayers, but only if the doctor donated socks. The local drunk claimed the cure was sniffing onions at sunrise. Honestly, it made as much sense as the rest. In one town, a jester impersonated the doctor, dancing through the streets yelling fake diagnoses. "You've got ghost fever. Your shadow is infected." The real doctor punched him. The crowd cheered. The jester later became mayor. When things got too dangerous, plague doctors were told to run. One guy tried, but after weeks of sleep loss, he just sat on his suitcase, stared at the fog, and whispered, "Let fate do its thing." A goat licked his hand. He stayed. Leeches were popular treatments, if you had a strong stomach. One doctor accidentally dropped a jar of them in a church. Chaos ensued. A nun fainted. A rat tried to eat one. The leeches vanished into the pews. They were never recovered. Disinfection usually meant fire. Some doctors got too enthusiastic and torched everything. Clothes, bedding, sometimes entire rooms. One burned a patient's mattress while they were still on it. It was symbolic, he claimed. The patient disagreed, loudly. A few rich towns tried to make plague protection fashionable. Jewel-encrusted beaks, silk robes. One doctor had velvet gloves with lace cuffs. He looked great until he tripped into a gutter. The velvet never recovered. Neither did his pride. One night, a doctor left his mask unattended. A family of mice moved in. He didn't notice until he put it on and felt wiggling. He screamed. The mice screamed, and the patient he was treating fainted. No one spoke of it again. Some doctors kept books of failed cures, frog sweat tea, powdered crab shell, and something ominously labeled plague pudding. These tomes were passed down like grim cookbooks. One survived, titled, "What Definitely Did Not Work Probably." A tired doctor fell asleep near a windowsill. When he woke up, 2 sparrows had nested in his beak. They chirped angrily when he moved. He whispered, "Let them have it," and finished the day without removing the mask. Bird doctor, level unlocked. One huckster followed plague doctors from town to town selling Dr. Beek's Miracle Tonic. It was just spiced wine and regret. One doctor tackled him mid-sales pitch. The crowd applauded. The huckster offered them a buy 2, get 1 free apology. Late at night, doctors sometimes spoke to the dying. Some confessed sins. Some begged for forgiveness. One patient calmly asked, "Can you feed my cat?" Another said, "I regret everything, especially trusting that barber." A baker gifted a plague doctor a meat pie as thanks. Turns out, the pie had been cursed by a jealous apothecary. When heated, it howled. The doctor fed it to a dog. The dog was fine. The apothecary mysteriously disappeared. One doctor entered a house so foul even the rats had fled. The walls wept moisture, the air buzzed. He looked around and said, "Nope." He left a note on the door. "Burn this place. Don't ask questions." It became standard procedure. Some towns were so desperate not to be quarantined, they hid their sick under floorboards, in cellars, even dressed them as scarecrows. One plague doctor walked through the village and said, "Why does every haystack look like it's breathing?" One doctor lined his beak with aromatic herbs and accidentally added a whistling reed. Every time he exhaled, it played a ghostly tune. He was followed by children thinking he was a magical bard. He hated every second. Pay was so bad, some plague doctors took side jobs, tutoring rich kids, writing bad poetry, or painting portraits in full plague gear. One made a killing sketching diseased but dignified portraits. They hang in a castle today, still frowning. Two doctors argued over whose treatment was better. Naturally, they dueled, using chamber pots. It ended when one slipped on an onion and fell into a latrine. The other was declared winner and immediately got lice. Victory was complicated. Every doctor had a fantasy, a warm bath, a mask-free morning, a life without groaning corpses. One wrote, "One day I'll raise goats, healthy ones." He didn't live to do it, but someone later named a goat farm in his honor, Dr. Beek's Ranch. Beards were trendy, but dangerous. Stray hairs caught infectious droplets, and herbs stuck in them like confetti. One doctor tried to shave with a rusty spoon. Another braided his beard into his mask straps. Innovation or desperation? Both. Wearing boots 16 hours a day and unwashed socks led to a new horror, foot buboes. "I diagnosed myself," wrote one doctor, "with tragic toes. Some cut holes in their boots for air. One just walked barefoot and claimed it built immunity. Some nobles became obsessed with plague masks and bought them as trophies. One aristocrat threw plague-themed dinner parties. Guests wore beaks. The main course was roast rat. No one attended twice. A desperate farmer once summoned a doctor, not for himself but for his goat. "She's coughing like me," he said. The doctor examined the goat, nodded solemnly, and gave it herbs. It recovered. The farmer didn't. The goat was promoted to household head. A half-mad doctor began talking to his mask. "It speaks to me," he claimed. "Tells me who'll die next." People avoided him. Ironically, he survived the longest. His mask is in a museum. Visitors say it hums during full moons. Doctors stuffed their masks with herbs. Too many herbs. One overachiever added mint, lavender, clove, cinnamon, and garlic. He sneezed nonstop for 2 days. His patient thought he was possessed and threw a shoe at him. Effective? Not really. Entertaining? Yes. Some cities sent progress reports to calm the public. Plague doctors had to write them. One wrote, "All is improving, only 83 dead today." Another sent, "I saw fewer rats, or maybe the same number. They move fast." Morale stayed confusing. A gang started stealing plague doctor masks to sell on the black market. One doctor woke up maskless and had to borrow a jester's hat. He improvised, "Laughter is healing." The patient died. The mask was recovered, stuffed with bread. Sometimes there were more corpses than coffins. Doctors had to tag bodies, sort limbs, and guess who belonged to which house. One said, "I never studied sorting meat puzzles in medical school." Someone else replied, "What school?" One doctor was so fed up he threw his beak mask into a well. It was fished out 2 days later by a curious boy who wore it proudly. The town thought the plague had returned and evacuated. The boy later became mayor. In one bizarre town, people idolized their plague doctor. They followed him in parades, gifted him pies, even painted murals of him slaying plague dragons. He hated it. "I just want to treat boils in peace," he said, sobbing into a custard tart. Some believed rats were intelligent plague messengers. One doctor spent weeks trying to negotiate with them using crumbs and Latin phrases. Nothing happened until the rats ate his diagnosis scrolls. He took it as a sign and retired immediately. One hospital had an entire closet for plague masks. A new hire opened it and fainted from the smell, dried sweat, vinegar, herbs, and sadness. They sealed the room with bricks. Legends say the masks are still muttering in there. During one patient visit, The ceiling caved in, a goat fainted, and lightning hit a tree outside. The doctor, unfazed, said, "Just another Tuesday," and applied ointment. Medieval burnout was very real. Rumor tells of a plague doctor who saw the whole thing coming, packed his beak, left town early, and became a vineyard owner in Italy. No one heard from him again, except in letters signed, "Formerly beaked, now buzzed." One town believed pickled vegetables could cure the plague. A doctor was forced to treat patients with medicinal cabbage. He tried to refuse. They locked him in a pantry until he agreed. "The only thing cured was my faith in humanity," he wrote. Some poor doctors couldn't afford real beak masks. One used paper mache and stiffened it with old porridge. It melted in the rain. Children pointed. A rooster attacked him. He called it the worst day of my already terrible career. Soap was rare and precious. One doctor dropped his last bar into a plague pit. He considered diving in for it. Instead, he rubbed himself with burnt rosemary and prayed. The rosemary did nothing. The smell offended a mule. A traveling apothecary sold a glowing jar of miracle ointment. A doctor bought it in desperation. It turned out to be crushed fireflies mixed with lard. It did nothing for buboes, but lit up beautifully under moonlight. Art, not medicine. In a dark house, a doctor treated what he thought was an unconscious noble. Hours later, he realized it was a mannequin dressed for burial. He left a note, "Excellent posture but vitals absent." Even he had to laugh, then cry a little. Some doctors customized their beaks, longer tips, shiny buttons, painted flames. One guy added a feather plume and called it fashion forward. Another glued tiny bells on his. Patients could hear him coming from 3 blocks away. They hid. A desperate town threw a patient into a cart and pushed it downhill toward the plague doctor's house. It crashed through his fence. He walked out, looked at the groaning figure, and muttered, "At least they sent someone this time." During one treatment, a priest handed the doctor a flask labeled "Blessed Liquid." The doctor poured it on a wound. The patient screamed. Turns out, it was high-proof ale. The wound didn't heal, but the area stayed sterilized and flammable. One eccentric doctor sang to his patients, believing vibration healed the soul. His go-to tune? A dirge called "Lament for the Festering." It caused more tears than cures. One patient asked, "Can I just die quietly instead?" Doctors were promised good money. Reality? The paymaster vanished. One doctor finally found him, living in luxury far from the outbreak, sipping wine, and pretending to be a tailor. The doctor didn't report him. He just stole his shoes. In a moment of desperation, one doctor tried eating stew using his mask's beak as a ladle. It didn't work. The broth spilled down his robe. The herbs in the beak turned to soup croutons. "I regret everything," he whispered, wet and spicy. Tired of constant grumbling, one doctor built a complaint wall outside his hut where townsfolk could write their frustrations. Within a week, it collapsed under the weight of angry notes, rotten vegetables, and one actual chicken. 2 rival plague doctors accused each other of malpractice. The town insisted on a duel, but in full plague gear. The sword fight lasted 40 seconds before one tripped over his robe and impaled a sack of onions. "Close enough," said the judge. During a midnight exam, a doctor kept hearing giggling. He assumed it was fevered hallucinations until he discovered the patient's niece hiding under the bed, pulling faces at him through his mask holes. She later became a theater legend. A doctor's robe hadn't been washed in 3 months. When he finally soaked it in vinegar, the liquid turned black, then started fizzing. He stared horrified. "If this robe were a patient," he muttered, "I'd declare it dead twice." Doctors carried lanterns at night, but one used a lantern filled with lamp oil and wine. He said it was all he had. When it exploded, he simply whispered, "Fair enough," and treated his singed eyebrows with lard and prayer. In a dramatic twist, a doctor got caught in a family feud. 2 noble houses accused each other of spreading the plague. The doctor treated both sides and then moved to a barn to avoid the screaming. The cows were less stressful. One day, someone stole his mask and pretended to be him. The imposter gave terrible advice, misdiagnosed a chicken, and declared a cat mayor. When the real doctor returned, people said, "You were funnier last week." He never recovered emotionally. When his beak cracked in half, he continued without it. I've smelled worse, he shrugged. People panicked at his exposed face, assuming it was a plague demon. The baker fainted. A dog howled. A local artist made a woodcut about it. The plague eased. The doctor stood on a hill, mask in hand, robe flapping in the breeze. Did I make a difference, he wondered. Somewhere, a rat coughed. Probably not, he muttered, and went back to treating rashes for 3 pence a day.